Felly mae newydd basio 7:07, felly nawn ni
We've
neud
just gone 7:30, so we'll make a start.
So we'll make a start. Felly croeso i chi i'r
So very warm welcome to you to this evening's webinar that's based on project work taking place on the Moelog and Fawr demonstration site near Llanrwst. This project focuses on the use of bolus technology to improve conception rates, calving period and herd health at Moelog and Fawr. My name is Don Williams and I'm the Red Meat Technical Officer covering North Wales, and I'll be the chair for this evening's webinar. Joining me this evening, we have the demonstration farmers Llion and Sian Jones, who farm at Moelog and Fawr, and Iwan Parry from Dolgellau Vets, who has been advising this project.
Which is based on project work from one of our red meat demonstration sites, Moelog and Fawr, ger Llanrwst. So the project at Moelog and Fawr looks at the use of bolus technology to improve conception rates, calving period and herd health on the farm. My name is Non Williams and I am a Red Meat Technical Officer for Farming Connect in North Wales, and I'll be steering the meeting this evening. So joining me tonight are our demonstration farmers, Llion and Sian Jones, who farm at Moelog and Fawr, and also Iwan Parry from Dolgellau Vets that has been advising on the project. Tonight's webinar will be recorded for our archive, as you may have heard already. So the webinar tonight will be conducted through the medium of Welsh. However, we do have an English simultaneous translation option available. So you can access this option by clicking the English option on the interpretation button on the bottom or top of your screen. So I hope that the translation facility
So
is
if you've clicked on English, you ought to be able to hear the interpreter. If you clicked on English, you ought to be able to hear the interpreter. Any issues, put them into the chat box and we'll do our best to resolve issues. So before we move on to discuss the Pacific project, I'm going to give you a brief overview of some of the services available via Farming Connect currently. So first of all, we have the advisory service. So this is an opportunity for you to have up to 80% funding towards one-to-one advice that's fully confidential on a range of topics, as you can see on screen, be it business advice or be it technical advice. And there's also a means to have this support funded to the tune of 100% if you take the advice as a group. Possibly some of you would have seen a video circulating on social media from our development officers this week, providing information about the skills funding that's available currently. And so the application window for skills funding is open currently, and it will be open until June 25th. And this is an opportunity again for you to have 80% funding towards training courses and again a range of topics covered. And since I've just alluded to our development officers, I'm sure that these are familiar faces for you in your respective areas. These are the people whom you need to contact if you need more details about our services. And obviously, there's a means for you to get in touch via our website or look on our website if you require any more details about any of our services. So with those few words then, I'll move on swiftly to introduce our panelists for this evening. And as I mentioned, the central theme for this webinar will be an overview of this project work that's been going on at Moelog and Fawr. So this is the title of the project, as you see on screen. And for those of you viewing this, might remember a Demonstration Farm Live event from Moelog and Fawr back last summer when this project was in its infancy. So this evening, we will just provide an update on the work that has been done since then. There'll be ample opportunity for you to ask questions to Llion and Sian or to Iwan later on, and we will do our utmost best to answer those questions. So you can ask your questions throughout the whole of the webinar by clicking on the Q&A question that's at the end, the bottom or at the top of your screen. So click on that tab, submit your question, and we'll do our utmost best to answer them. So first of all then, we'll hear from Llion and Sian. as I mentioned, they farm at Moelog Fawr, and we are very fortunate to have an opportunity to work with farmers who are so innovative in their approach to being a demonstration farm. And that's evidenced in this project and the work on the demonstration farm generally. So welcome both, and thank you very much for giving of your time to join us. And so to start with then, could you provide the context in terms of the farm and specifically the herd? We're a beef and sheep farm. We run about 1,000 feet, ranging up to about 1,500. There's a flock of Welsh sheep here and some crossbred ewes as well. We cross with the Aberfield. We rear our own replacements in terms of ewes, and everything else goes to Dunbia. Well, the vast majority of it that goes to Dunbia. We try to do everything of grass. The herd of cows, then we rear all of our own replacement heifers. They all calve during the spring period, and we try to essentially get them all done in about a 9 to 10 week period. And obviously we hope to bring that calving period down. And we've been keeping all of our heifers to try to increase numbers somewhat. We keep some bulls on. They usually run as bull beef, and we finish them at 14 months. There are a few then who are sold for breeding purposes. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for that brief background. Possibly some of our viewers are aware of what you're doing on farm. So thank you for that. So this project focuses on herd fertility more than anything else. So before we turn to talking about that project in any great detail, what was your previous system of getting the heifers in calf before starting the project? Well, previously we used to synchronize using seeders. We'd put seeders into everything, we'd serve everything, and it did take time. So it did work all right in terms of getting everything served. All in all, it was somewhat costly, and we want to make the system work a bit more naturally. Thank you very much. We'll move on then. I'm sure that we are all looking forward to seeing, and we saw the videos of the views and the stock out on such a lovely day as today. So we'll move on then. So these were the project's aims. We'll give a moment so for everyone to have a look at these, but before we delve into any great detail, you did talk about how you would get your heifers in calf before the project. So why were you interested in trialing bolus technology as part of the project? What was the reason behind that? Why was there an interest in that element? Well, we were looking for a way essentially to save on time and to try to tighten up that calving period. And obviously we were looking around, we were looking at collars, looking at some other options as well. And we came across this bolus option. And we attended a Farming Connect meeting, and I liked the fact, to be honest, that it did more than just the one thing. Whereas the collars we looked at, they only measured and showed heat detection. They didn't monitor the health, the eye, and the calving and so forth. So I think the boluses therefore do a bit more. They do those things, and again, it's down to saving on time. It does save on a lot of watching and observing and so forth. So that was the main reason, essentially. Thank you very much. So obviously you've touched on a number of the objectives there. in what you said, using these boluses to try to tighten up that calving period, that conception rate, that you were able to give them AI at the most appropriate time. And you touched on your calving period as well, and your calving pattern, and also keeping an eye on costs and getting the veterinarian out at the most appropriate time to do the right things. We move on then to the initial stages of the project then. And you touched on this at the Demo Farm Live event last year. So we've got a video here. So it's a total of 39 rumen boluses that were administered, SmackStack boluses. And there's a video here. It's a video of the boluses being administered in April of last year, 39 in total. And the screen at the bottom shows the trailer that you adopted for the base station that essentially collected the data. So could you tell us a bit then briefly about the processes of the boluses being administered, and what was the role of the base station and the trailer in data collection? The boluses need to be 30 meters away from the base station, so that's why we put the trailer there with a solar panel on it to power it. And since the heifers were out, that trailer essentially followed them around. We'd open a neighbouring paddock or neighbouring field, and the trailer would be there. So that's the rationale behind the old trailer. And in a way, the bolus then would send a signal to that particular base station. The data was then collected, and the data then sent to the server and sent to both of you to your phones. Am I right? Both of us had an app on our phone, and therefore we could have notifications. If there were any attributes that the bolus worked at monitoring temperature, and if there was anything that crossed over a threshold that was deemed to be not normal, we'd get a notification. And in terms of if they were drinking less than normal, we'd be given a notification because that could be the telltale sign of a health problem. So if the temperature was too high or too low, we'd have a notification. And in terms of bulling then, it measured the activity. If the activity level crossed a certain threshold, we would have again a notification. And when it comes to calving, there is a temperature change in the approach too, and therefore we'd have a notification for that as well. Thank you very much. So that gives everyone an idea of how essentially what you had to keep an eye out for. So you started to monitor the heifers back in June, if I remember correctly, and you received this data from the boluses, but also you were observing the heifers physically yourself. You mentioned that some of the in-laws assisted with that. And Sian, during that period, you were putting together a lot of data, as we can see on that top image. So what type of information would you note, and what were you looking out for as you observed them? We were able to observe who and what was bullying and so forth, and we'd have those notifications and everything really assisted with the monitoring. So I put everything on the spreadsheet, and I would note what we would observe visually, because we'd watch them as usual. But since it was a new project, we didn't know that if we could trust the technology fully. So observing was a big part of it, and also we were taking note of the heat index, showing really how strong the heifers were bulling. It was on a scale of 1 to 5, and the minute we'd have a notification, and as we monitored, we understood that some were bullying, that we'd had a notification, and as we looked at the situation, they weren't quite reaching the upper level. So we spoke to Helen from Vestex, and she brought it down to 40. And that was the threshold. Now, it turned out that we were having false notifications. I think we'd rather have those false notifications than missing anything, to be honest. So I think that was the greatest advantage, was this monitoring and trying to establish a pattern after the bolus went in to when we started to observe them, and then moving through to a period when AI would be administered. So it was a matter of looking at which ones were cycling and which ones weren't, and we were then able to address any situations that arose, or if there were any problems, we'd address them sooner than what we would have usually. Sometimes we'd turn them to the bull instead of using AI multiple times and trying to catch them visually. So as you mentioned there, the bottom left, just to give viewers an idea of what you received on your telephone app, or if you were looking at your computer screen for every heifer. And you mentioned there about that monitoring period. I'm sure that Iwan will touch on this later on, but Iwan did visit the farm mid-June to assess the heifers to start with. Now, do you want to talk briefly about the purpose of that assessment by Iwan? We just wanted to see what Iwan was seeing and whether it matched up with what the bolus were telling us. And we scored them accordingly, fertility score, and essentially saw that things did actually correlate, and what Iwan felt on his inspection as well, just to ensure that everything did run in tandem, that everything correlated, and that everything was fine and healthy. Okay, we'll move on then. As you mentioned at the start, the bolus obviously gathered data throughout the whole of the year, to be honest. So you were using these boluses during the calving period also, and we can see on the right-hand side the notification that you had prior to the first heifer actually calving, and this is the heifer having calved within 36 hours. So the bolus sent you the notification 36 hours previously. So you were receiving these notifications throughout the calving period. Iwan will touch a bit more on the results, but do you want to talk a bit more about the notifications? We did receive a notification between 36 and 38 hours. That was the window. At the start, we'd catch one or two of them starting, but because the time was getting longer and some of them we'd have 36 hours notice, it changed consistently. So I think it depended a lot on it. If you had 5 or 6 calving at the same time, sometimes you'd lose track of when did you receive which notification. It was helping, giving you a heads up, but because of the length of time, it tended to mean that we'd lose track somewhat. If possibly would have been easier to monitor, but often you'd forget that you'd had a notification. I mean, 36 hours is a long time for a ping on the phone. Excellent, thank you very much. So then we'll move on briefly before Iwan looks at the results. So in terms of the labour at the start, did you see any change in the time that you spent before and after sort of administering boluses? To be honest, we watched them to the same extent because, as was mentioned, we didn't know if we could trust the system or not. But I'm not saying that we've saved all that much time this year, but if we did leave it to the bolus and trust it, well, I think it would lead to a saving in time. It'll be interesting to see that in the forthcoming year, if there is any change, if you have used the bolus for another year. And then obviously on the screen here, we've got a table looking at the veterinary costs and so forth over the past 3 years. This is when you were using the CEDA system and then you introduced the bolus. So it's just important to note at this point that the figures don't cost the pelvic measurements on and the maturity scoring that Iwan did, because that was a separate assessment. And we can see that there has been a significant saving in terms of expenditure on services, or on veterinary services. Now, obviously, we have to keep in mind that there has been some upfront costs to purchase the boluses and so forth, which hasn't been included here. So if anyone is keen to hear a bit more about that, I would suggest that you get in touch directly with SmackDex. I'm not sure if anyone of you two have anything to add at this point about the fact that you have been able to make a significant saving on the veterinary costs, if nothing else, for fertility treatments. Well, it's been possible to make a financial saving, and that's excellent to see. And it means that we followed the natural data and what came from the heifers in doing so. Obviously, making a financial saving is a positive, and it will depend on the circumstances of the year and matters that arise during the year. So that obviously is a positive result that we're able to make a financial saving. So we'll move on quickly. Thank you both for that conversation. So we'll move on then, if that's all right. And it's my pleasure to welcome Iwan from Dolgellau Vets to discuss the results. We are exceptionally fortunate to have had Iwan being a key part of this project, always at the end of the phone, always happy to offer advice. So Iwan, over to you, and we'll remind everyone to submit your questions if you have any during this presentation, and we'll do our utmost best to answer those questions. Thank you. Well, good evening, everyone. First of all, I think we need to thank Non and Theon and Shan and Farming Connect essentially for having the vision in the first place to look at this type of work. It's very innovative work in a world during which we've been discussing fertility for a number of years, but as far as I'm aware, this is the first time that we've seen this type of bolus being utilized in a beef herd. So it was challenging. So it's natural for Theo to talk about, well, I wasn't sure if I could trust the bolus or not. I think that was the initial work, and that's the territory it took us into. So the importance of data was essentially the starting point, and the way that we could use that data to effectively ensure that we could have a tight calving period, and also making the best possible use of AI in order for us to bring new genetics into this particular herd. So, Non, if you could move to the first slide then, please. Now, this is a slide that will scare everyone, but I'll take you through it quite simply. On the bottom, you'll see a list of dates. So that initial period from the 5th to the 6th of April, that is when we started our assessments. And the line with the red arrow at the top of it, and you'll find that my eyesight's pretty bad, that'll be on about 6th of the 6th. That's when the project actually started. So that's the date that you'll find on the bottom. Then you've got the green line then, that is the heat index, or as we've called it, the bolus heat in actual fact, because on top of that again, you will see the daily activity. Now, that is important. However, it's background information, but you will see that the bolus heat does pick up and does go over the threshold that Shan alluded to earlier of taking it down from 50 to 40. That was the threshold at which we said, well, the bolus is telling us that she is now bulling. Then further up, we have the external temperature, and you'll see above the bolus heat that there's a VH, that's visual heat. So we had 2, if not 3 pairs of eyes looking at these daily to see if they correlated with what the bolus was telling us. And we would look for the difference in days between one bolus heat and the next notification to see if it was an expected period, which is 22 to 23 days. 21 to 28 can be the case in places, but it's consistently good. You will then see AI, where she has received an AI, and you will see a P positive. That tells you the result of the scan that happened to tell us that the heifer was in calf. You will then see a pink block. That pink block is when the EI period finished and the bull was turned to the herd. So that on screen is all the data for one particular heifer in its entirety for the whole of the period. Now, we'll break it down now, step by step, to look at what we wish to focus on. But the result on everyone's mind, what did you get? At the end of the project, we had the result that in terms of the heifers that were part of the project, 95% of them were in calf in a very tight period. And that is obviously positive and a good result. So we'll move on then to the next slide. So we'll break this down. This is the same heifer as it happens. So you'll see the dates. And what we are looking for here is whether or not the visual observation of heat actually correlated with the bolus heat. Now, this is how we wish it to be, but unfortunately, it wasn't the case every time. By undertaking this type of work, if it's 100% in everything, you will question the validity of the data. So when you undertake a project such as this one, very often you have to see some areas where you seek to improve, and also how we need to adjust or amend the findings and use them again. So we see here that the bolus and the visual heat, the length of the project, as we see on screen, is 79%, which is quite a high rate. In all fairness, it's very high. It's a positive indication. What happens to the other 20%? That's the challenge, but certainly the bolus did correlate with the visual observation for 79% of the time. Then, for the regular estrus cycle, according to the bolus, as appears on screen, every 22 to 23 days, well, that happened at 55% in instances. You could say that's low, but with heifers, they can vary significantly. And obviously, we only had a set period at the start to get all of the measurements in place and to get the observation done and to check that the bolus was telling us that the heifers were bulling. You'll see later on that there are some that are difficult to deal with, but that shows you that that's where that figure came from, that 55%, the regular heat interval according to the bolus, that was correct 55% of the time. We'll now move on, and this is a different heifer. Now, we have seen the initial bolus heat, but it's been slightly irregular thereafter, and we were slightly unsure as to what happened with this one. So we didn't see a visual heat when the bolus heat showed the second spike there. So what we did was we decided that we would inject with Estromit mid-cycle, and we'd go with what the bolus would tell us, although we hadn't seen and were able to confirm. And certainly the heifer did respond to the Estromit, and she was bulling 72 hours, 3 days after the injection was administered. So we again had a bolus heat and a visual heat this time around, and she was given EI, and she caught. So that was obviously a positive one. When you are trying to block and when you're utilizing EI, this type of work is absolutely essential in order to ensure effectively that instead of finding ourselves in a position where we are playing catch up, that we were tightening up and working from the outset. So an early indication of those who weren't cycling properly, that's 26%. And we can do something about that. And overall, it was quite successful. And you'll see at this point that the cow is now in calf after the positive AI. That threshold of 40 is still in place, and you will see the green activity on the bottom, and they don't cross that threshold. And that is obviously what we'd expect, because she's in calf, and there wouldn't be any reason whatsoever for us to see that she would be giving any indication that she was bulling in any way. Now, that wasn't the case every time, unfortunately, and that was a cause of some frustration, and that did amount in 39% of the cases, giving us the perfect picture of being in calf, that it was confirmed that she was in calf. So we'll move on then on, please, to the next one. And what we have in this slide is another heifer yet again. And as you can see, before the initial, there was nothing to tell us that the heifer was bulling. And in that initial period, still nothing by sign of bulling. And we tried to administer estimate. However, we didn't manage to get her in calf. But when the bull went in, she was in calf immediately, and she was in calf on that date, according to the scan result. So how many of them had absolutely no indication of heat by the bolus? That was a figure of 11%. On the one hand, we were equally hard on the people who were out there. However, showed no sign of estrus from visual observation, and that was 8%. And Leon and Robin were glad that they beat the bolus by 3% in terms of that. So again, that just shows you that it is project work, and it is work that is working with cold and clinical data, and we have to include these types of figures in order to give the complete and honest picture as we report on any such experiment. Now, the lack of regular heat interval, according to the bolus, that stands at 45%. If I remember correctly, it's 45%. But one can work with the bolus when you've got a problem such as that one. We'll move on another slide on, please, to another heifer, and we can see that there's a fair bit of movement on this graph. Now, the bolus heat, when we were in that observation period, you can see that it's all over the place. And as a result of that, we decided quite early on, after having that visual heat, as opposed to the bolus heat in this respect, in this case, we estimated again, and we had visual heat. There wasn't a strong bolus heat, and she stood for AI. Now, unfortunately, as you can see later on, in early October and moving into mid-October, you can see after having been quiet for a period of time, the bolus heat started to cross the heat detection threshold. And that made us worry, because this was about a fortnight or so, 10 days before we actually scanned the heifers. And that made us think, okay, we've got an empty one here. But when we scanned, the bolus had expressed something that wasn't reality, and the heifer had indeed stood for the initial AI, and that had been administered because of a lack of consistency in bolus heat at the start. You can look at this in two ways. You can look at it in a negative way by saying that the bolus isn't working, but when you have these kinds of figures, when we think, well, actually it triggers you to do something, and by having an early intervention measure in place, ultimately we were able to ensure that this heifer was in calf in the early part of the cycle, so she is very tight in calving. And there we have it. Index not reaching the threshold. There were 21% of the indices that didn't quite get to the threshold in the monitoring period. And then we'll move on to the next one. And we're now coming into the nitty-gritty, which are the results of the scanning. And what we see in that first graph, how many stood to AI, how many got in calf to AI, and how many stood for the bull. And that is an excellent figure to see. And in the next graph over, we have a comparison as to how many were in calf after first service of AI. And the result this time around is an increase of 10%. Being in calf after working with the bolus to help us, and that will tell us directly, and we'll have direct influence on the genetics that Leon and Sian have managed to introduce to the herd without losing any time, may I add, because it was vitally important for both that that calving period was tightened, that it wasn't extended. And anyone who's been working with AI will know that it is a huge challenge to ensure that we don't lose any time. And both have managed exceptionally well, in all fairness. Thank you, Ron. There's one more. As we look at the calving period, calving within the first 6 weeks, 88%, and that isn't reliant on the scanning result or the work, but it's what's on the ground. So there isn't any cheating the figures. They are figures that are honest. And at this point, I'll thank Leon, but I think we need to thank Leon. I'm sure that Leon will agree with me that Sian's work with that initial process of collecting the data to ensure that the data was active, that the data was up to date and validated, and the way that Sian has and Non have been able to collaborate to bring this to fruition is absolutely excellent. And I have nothing but admiration of the pair of you for being able to do that. It's one thing for Leon and Robin to watch them bulling, but working with these data sets, data which is on-farm data, which is actual, which is factual, and it's open for any scrutiny, working with that data is excellent. And this is the final question, and I'm sure that you saw it in Leon's smile when Non asked how effective the bolus notification was for calving. Well, this is how it breaks down. 36 hours for that notification, and she does calve. 58% responded positively to that 36-hour notification. 42% didn't respond positively. They calved after 36 hours from response. And you could say, well, that's fine. But as Leon said, when you're very busy on the farm, where there's so much calving happening at the same period, you do tend to question, however useful this type of data and information is, it's nothing in terms of its usability initially of when to look at bolus heat and when to give AI and so forth. And this bolus obviously is being amended, it's being adjusted. Obviously, I suggest that we need to repeat the work. As soon as a piece of work is done, we need to repeat to see if the results are replicated in order for us to have full validation of data. And with those few words, I have nothing to say, but thank you very much. And I'm more than happy to take any questions that anyone may have. Thank you. Thank you very much, Iwan, for analysing those results for us. And thank you for the advice and the support throughout the project. So before we move on to any questions that there may be, if you want to review those graphs, or if you want to look at anything in any greater detail, you can have a look at our website on the Moelog an Fawr page. You'll be able to see the result there if you want to have another look at them, and there'll be more details that will be included as well. So we'll start then, Leon and Sian, with one or two questions to you to start with, about your opinions on how the project's going to date. So first of all, how have you found things to date, and which aspects of the data have you felt to be most useful for you during this past year? When we were having those notifications from the bolus, they were useful because it gave us a serving window for AI, essentially. It gave us the opportune time for serving those heifers. To be honest, it would go from green to red and back to green. And that made a huge difference in terms of being able to serve the heifers at the right time. I think it cut out so many hours in terms of when it was the opportune time. It gave us the number of hours, and it gave us the best time to serve them. I think that's what helped us the most. It's what essentially we credit the high rate of conception to. The fact that we knew what the cycling trends were before we started observing them. That gave us an indication. I think if something doesn't cycle regularly, I think it's time to intervene, and that in itself is a time saving, because we're able to observe the patterns beforehand. Excellent, thank you very much. So to turn it another way then, did you see that there were any specific issues or any problems or any challenges even when you started on this work? I would say that the biggest issue was the distance from the base station. Very often, in the end, we were having to put the base station next to them, essentially just to read the data. I think that was the biggest challenge, to make sure that they were close enough to the base station in order for the data to be acquired, because we desperately wanted that data in order for the project to work and for us to monitor who were bullying and so forth. SmackSec as a company, they have gone back and I think the range now is over 100 meters in terms of the data being able to be collected. They have talked about that already. And I think personally that would be a great help, to be honest. The challenge was getting the base station so close to the heifers. Obviously, and there's a lot of work and a lot of development with regular developments as to how the system will be improved. You mentioned there the distance between the heifers and the base station. I think that I'm right in saying, Sian, during that initial period, obviously you wanted that data immediately, but the boluses are able to store, I think it's up to 50 days worth of data. So you saw subsequently after the calving period that you needn't be as concerned about that data being uploaded as often. We happen to be observing them, and because we were going there to watch them as well, the trailer naturally wouldn't follow them around everywhere. And in terms of the health side of it, it was useful at certain times. Right at the start, there was an issue with one or two with a high temperature, so we were able to have a look at them and to check that they were right, and the temperature was high. But we were able to observe and ensure that everything was right. I think later on we weren't taking as much attention of that. When you knew what the telltale signs were, what to observe, I think that gave you some comfort. And obviously, if there was an issue that arose without us noticing, well, it triggered us to view. So if I could bring you one into the discussion now, then we had the chat with Lleon and Sian at the start. Now you did that blind assessment back in June. What about the importance of that at the start in order to possibly instill some confidence in data usage and then relying on the bolus? Well, the three of us thought that was important as a starting point to get that confidence in place, because it was a blind assessment and it was quite a challenge to see how closely correlated the bolus and visual would be. But from having a good day doing that, it afforded an opportunity and instilled some confidence in this for everyone to be able to prepare themselves to say, we believe that this is happening. It conforms with what we had seen during the scanning. And certainly, I think it's a part of ensuring that we got that good initial period. I mean, the hard work had been done prior to the monitoring and the AIing, because that period showed us which ones weren't showing heat, showed us which heifers were irregular, and showed the ones that were cycling regularly, the vast majority as it happens. So that was challenging. It's probably one of the most challenging things that I've done in putting my head on the block, but I think that it has been of significant benefit if it was just on that basis. Excellent, thank you very much. I'll stop sharing the screen in case we miss any questions. Now, Another question for Llŷn and Sian, possibly. What next? Obviously, the boluses are in the heifers. Now, what's the next step for the project in terms of data collection? Is there anything that you'd like to focus on, or anything specifically that you'd like to develop? It'd be interesting to see if the results will be different as the cows get older. Now, I'm not sure if Smastics have put a bolus in with a leading period previously. Possibly there'll be a change in that. So it'll be interesting to see if the data will be different, or whether because the cows will be older, whether the results or the readings will be different. And I think that's the interesting thing for me, to see and observe how things develop. Hopefully, we'll be starting to monitor again this week, and hopefully we can replicate the same types of patterns. And as you mentioned, now that it has been done for a year, we now know what to look out for in terms of the data. What were the trends that you observed, and we will be able to look at those for the forthcoming year. I think that's it in terms of questions, unless there are any other questions. Or Iwan, do you have anything that you would like to add to the discussion before we conclude matters? No, as I mentioned, it has been challenging, because when you do any project for the first time, obviously you're essentially innovating and preparing the ground when it comes to using data. Now, it's proven that it's worthwhile. It can be difficult, it's hard work, but through collaboration, we've succeeded and we've been able to use that data. In terms of the herd, then, I will take a great interest to see how early will these cows start to show some level of activity post calving, and that will be something that'll tell us if the cow can be turned out and can be put to mating, so that we can maintain the block. And in my mind, that will be equally important as to when they will bull for the first time. We expect a fertile cow to show some kind of sign as soon as under 30 days. And it'll be interesting to see what the bolus tells us in that respect. I think that being part of trialing something like this, and as Llŷn said, in heifers that were very young, it's no surprise that some of the readings were all over the shop, because they hadn't quite settled down themselves as heifers. But to get the results at the end of the day, I think it's just been absolutely fantastic, to be honest. And it clearly shows that through using data and through collaboration and combining data and the old methodology, that we can succeed in obtaining some excellent results. And I think because these heifers will now be tightly blocked, that will be the basis for the herd for the future. So the next heifers coming into the herd need to be in equally tight a block in order for us to maintain that bulling period and that calving period. Now, if we lose any of that in the heifers, it's pretty much impossible to do anything with the cows thereafter. So the calving period for heifers, it's vitally important, and it has been a roaring success in that respect. Thank you very much, Iwan. And I truly look forward to see the data results coming in over the year to compare the individual heifers and the data set for this year compared to what will be next year, to see if it'll be replicated. So thank you very much for the work. Unless there are any more questions, we'll finish promptly. Can I finish by saying a few words of thanks initially to you who have joined us this evening, who have been able to get your work done in the sun, because we are due to have some heavy rain tomorrow. So thank you very much for joining us. I'm thankful to Llŷn and Sian for giving your time to join us, because I know you're busy. And thank you for the wider work that you've been doing and your input into this project and everything else that you do in your role as demonstration farmers. Thank you for that. Iwan, thank you for joining us and giving us an insight. As I mentioned earlier, you're always at the end of the phone, always happy to answer questions and to offer myself, Llŷn and Sian advice. We truly appreciate that. Hopefully translation has been right for you, that you've been able to understand everything. On your way, as you leave the webinar, you will be referred to an evaluation form. I would be very grateful if you could complete that evaluation form. It's just a quick form in order for us to have an idea of what you would like to see covered in future events and webinars and so forth. It would be excellent if you could complete that evaluation form. So with those few words, can I thank everyone for joining us this evening, and hopefully we'll see you at a future event, hopefully out on farm, if not in another webinar. With those few words, thank you very much and good evening.